What I want to talk about today is basically adjusting and editing your reference images. So I'm going to unlock each of these images. I've got three. I'm going to mainly focus on these three because they're a good starting point, but keep in mind when you have your reference photos, this is sort of the basic set that I recommend, which is the sort of a full turn with 1/8 turns or 45-degree turns each time. And then we want a nice clear view from below the chin and one from above, again, so we can get a sense of the shape of the head, right? And I have people do this as well so you can really see your muscles in contraction, which is very useful. So we're going to basically get to something like this, which will provide a good template. So in order to get these things all into one layer, first what I'll do is I'll hit W for wand, and I think by default now it goes to the quick select wand. So I will just use the bracket key to enlarge my brush and quickly select through. And if you hold shift, you can add more to the selection. This brush is supposed to be sort of like a smart brush, right? So we'll try to learn what you want to select as you add or subtract, and I'm holding Alt if I want to subtract. So let's just, there we go, get that corner in. And I'll just double check from this view that I'm not sort of clipping off anything too essential. So again, I'll hold Alt because I'm kind of selecting the opposite, right? I'm selecting the background, and I'll flip this mask around in a second. Okay. So that seems pretty good. By the way, there is a special mode in Photoshop which is called Quick Mask, which is the letter Q. So when you hit Q, it'll show you in red what is going to be unselected or selected, and what in white will be the opposite of that. So you can actually now paint, if you paint in black with a brush. I'll just show you this. So not a lot of people realize this mode exists, and when you hit Q, it'll go back and adjust that selection. So you can actually do paint-based selection in Photoshop, and that's been around for a long time. Now, if I want to flip selections, you can do Control Shift I. Right, so if I hit Q now, the background is selected. And I think while I'm in this mode, if I do Control Shift I, yeah, it won't affect it, but in the masking mode, or when you're just in the regular view mode, Control Shift I will flip your selection back and forth. So I'll use this to basically create a layer mask. So I'm going to hit the layer mask option. So I had to flip my selection to select Julian here. And we can do kind of the same thing, basically, in the other layers. So if you wanted to keep the layer masking together, you could just Control C, Control V, and paste these images in. So Control A to select everything, Control C to copy, Control V to paste. And we'd simply just repeat the process that I just outlined. So I would use that wand tool, hold shift to add to the selection, and then just double check that we're not selecting stuff we don't want. So I'll go down and hold Alt and just kind of paint out the stuff that I want to make sure is selected correctly. So maybe I'll just get more of this in here. So it's almost done. Okay. So then I will Control Shift I again. Oops, Control Shift I. There we go. And click the layer mask button down here. Okay, so again, repeat the process. Going to zoom out a little bit. To zoom out, it's Control minus. Okay, and then I'll zoom in. By the way, you know, sometimes when you're working on this stuff as well, if you want to hide the marching ant line, you can hit Control H, which will hide and unhide the kind of marching ants line. Sometimes that's useful. In this case, I do want to more clearly see what I'm actually selecting here. Okay, so Control Shift I, and then add a layer mask. So the next step is to align all these images, and I probably need a wider canvas. Oh, he's kissing himself. So if I go, I believe it's Alt-Control-C, brings up the canvas size, which you can also get to through image canvas size. One of the things I love about Photoshop is any function that has a shortcut will be labeled right next to that tool, so you can very quickly kind of pick up the shortcuts for these things. And in this tool, I'm going to switch. So this is canvas size. Alt-Control-C is how I got here, and I usually switch to percentage. And I'll just set the percentage for now to 150. Okay, and then if I hit Control-0, that will frame the full image size. And now I can just move these versions of Julian off to the side here. So we want them to kind of be visible. Now, the other thing is, I want to kind of see if this thing is level. You might detect or notice that the center view, his head's tilted to one side. And that head tilt, even if that's present in a side view, can skew things because of perspective. So things may not fully line up, which can present a challenge. And one of the easiest fixes is to just go back and reshoot your images, which we can do a bit today. But in this case, you know, if I rotate, I don't really have a guide as to what that's going to look like. So I'm going to just hit Escape here. Photoshop, I think by default now does not show rulers. You can go to Windows and then go to, View, and then go to Rulers, which is Control R. So that's my little shortcut. Control R, and then if you're in the Move tool, which is V, if you left click and drag from the left-hand side, you can pull out a little ruler guide. If you can do it, you can do it from the top as well. So we can sort of say, you know, I want to make sure I'm measuring the top of the head. So I often pull out a lot of these guides to sort of see what's level, what's not. And by the way, I think by default snapping is on. And again, the shortcut is Control-Shift-semicolon. So you can turn that off as well. I find it's useful in some situations, in others it's not. So I'm going to zoom in here. If you do Alt-Control-0, that will give you the actual size, and we can hit Control plus or minus to zoom in and out. Control-T will activate your, it'll activate your transform tool. In this case, you know, I may want to actually just kind of delete or crop out the background. Always save an original copy of your files. But in this case, what you can do is, if you select over where you have the layer mask, you can right-click and say Apply Layer Mask. And it'll literally just erase out the excess that's in the image. So now if I hit Control-T, you see that's much closer to you know, where Julian's pixels are visible. Now if you want to, you can either use the tip of the nose. I find that's often a good sort of area to pivot from. You can move your pivot point. There's usually a tiny little center dot, and we can move that pivot point to what would be roughly the center of his nose. And then I'll rotate and just try to get this level. And if I need another guide, I'll left click and drag one from the top just to sort of check, let's say, the corners of the lips. And you know, most people's faces are not perfectly symmetrical, so don't expect it to line up perfectly, but I think this looks pretty good. And so for me, I often look at, again, roughly the apex of the brows, the middle line of where the eyelids roughly sit, the base of the nose. Now, you know, depending on the perspective of the lens, depending on the head tilt that may be present or not, usually the ear sits between the bottom of the earlobe. So the bottom of the nose will sit at in line with the base of the earlobes, and the tops of the ears will line up with roughly the brow. Again, may not be totally visible or true in this case, but I'm going to also put some markers in for the top and bottom edges of the lips. And then I'll hit enter just to apply my transform as well. So these are, again, just sort of rough approximate guides for me to try to line things up. Now if I look at the side view, I'm going to right click and go to layer 2 here. You know, these things seem to match up pretty well, right? They're not exactly perfect, but they're pretty good. In this case, again, I might need or might want to try rotating that image. And again, I can right-click and apply the layer mask for each of these layers. So I'm going to select, again, this this view here, and then rotate. So sometimes it's a matter of just kind of rotating things into position, nudging them. You might have to scale if you're further or closer away from the camera. But yeah, generally speaking, I'm mainly kind of looking at the eye, the eyebrow, the base of the nose. You know, the ear is always something that can kind of skew off a little bit. Okay. Now, while it's useful or handy to have these sort of front and two side views, I often kind of want it when I start just kind of referencing one of the side views. In this case, because this side's better lit, I'll probably start with that side. But don't just rely on those 2 or 3 images. You should be looking at every single image, and if you've got a mirror, since you're doing your own self-portrait, look at your face in 3 dimensions. Look at it from different angles. Look at it from extremes. Now, you can't do that with a mirror, but at least with your camera, you can get this kind of top and bottom view that you wouldn't normally get, right? So again, I'll just sort of tweak the right view. I still like, you know, even though I may not use that right view, this right side view exclusively or that much, I still, you know, may want to refer to it. And again, I think he's a little further away on this turn, so I'll hold shift and rotate, shift and scale this out just a bit, and then I'll sort of tweak the positioning and rotation a bit as well. In some cases, you may have to skew your proportions, but generally speaking, I would try to avoid that as much as possible. Okay, so it sort of lines up with a lot of the major stuff. It doesn't line up with everything properly, but close enough. So I would just save this as a PSD, and then what my next step would be, you can turn off the guides, by the way, with Control semicolon. Next step is to crop. Now you can crop the overall image just to start, so we got everything framed up a little bit better. And I usually will try to center my crop. Again, I want to center the crop to that nose on the center image. And I'll just drag it down a bit. If you hold Alt, it'll scale in towards the center as well. So you get a nice kind of symmetrical crop. Okay, so I'll hit Enter. And then what I would do is, the main thing about this is very important. You want to actually crop the same height. So I'm going to do just an individual left and an individual right. So this whole process is mainly so I can cleanly align the views to get as close to a good alignment as possible. All right, so I crop this, and then I could probably turn off the other layers that are visible. And if you want, generally a good idea, put a white background in behind. I've seen some people do this too, where they put like a really bright background, like a bright green or something, which you know, could be okay. Just if it helps you see it better, there's nothing wrong with that for sure. So you could do something like that, although I find it a little hard on the eyes. So again, making sure you crop the full height and do it the same way for each of the reference images, because when you line this up in ZBrush and you load them into the draw mode, it should be nice, clean, and already kind of pre-aligned for you, right? Because we've done all this work in Photoshop. So you do, you know, save this out as a JPEG. I'll just show you an example of what I've done earlier. So I do that once, save it out, maybe hide the other images, right? Crop this thing, save it out. So in my example set, I'll just show you here. I've done this as well. So I've got kind of the two images. And like I said, I'm going to basically use this image as my primary image. As my primary side view, I should say, sorry. One other thing I noticed too, ZBrush was crashing a lot when I set this up. So, and I think it's because of one function. I'm going to show you one issue that can happen. Originally when I cropped these, because the image size is really, really large, right? So if I crop this thing down, if you take a look at the image size, it was really, really high resolution. And again, I always focus on the height because the height's going to be the same. The width might be different from one reference image to the next, but once we've done this alignment, you want to keep the height the same. So I did lower my resolution on each crop, or you could do it pre-crop, right, where you basically just say, I'm going to temporarily lower the res on this to 1600 for the height, and then do your cropping at that point if you want. So I think ZBrush maybe runs out of RAM if you have too heavy of reference images in your scene.